Hey there, neighbors. Just a quick request before we jump into the episode. I've been posting a lot more short form content on places like Instagram and TikTok, and then reposting that stuff to places like Threads and X and Facebook. So if you would, go to the podcast website, www.neighborontheleft.com, and in the contact section, all the social media links are there. Stop on over and check out some of the short form content. It tends to be a bit more lighthearted, at least some of it, more comedic than the heavy podcast episodes. But I would love to have you stop by, and if you'd be so kind to like and follow what you see. Thank you very much. And on to the episode. Today, I want to start off with a little thought experiment. So indulge me, if you would. Imagine for a second that while Joe Biden was president, his Justice Department issued an indictment against the Heritage Foundation because it had confidential sources embedded inside violent left-wing extremist groups. Now try to picture that. Picture the cable news graphics and the outrage and the congressional hearings with 12 men named Chip and Brent yelling the word tyranny like they were trying to win a contest. Fox News would be treating it like the sequel to The Fall of Rome. Elon Musk would probably tweet a grainy black and white image photo of George Washington looking disappointed. And, Newsmax, somebody on Newsmax would compare it to Stalin by lunchtime. And honestly, they'd have a point. Because regardless of your politics, the idea of the federal government aggressively prosecuting a major ideological organization that opposes the administration should make people at least a little uncomfortable. That's supposed to set off alarm bells in a democracy, or at minimum, one of those smoke detectors with the dying battery that chirps every 30 seconds until you lose your mind. Well, as it turns out, now the Trump Justice Department is prosecuting the Southern Poverty Law Center, the SPLC for short, one of the most famous anti-hate organizations in America. And suddenly a whole lot of people who spent years screaming about weaponized government are reacting like this is totally normal. It's totally fine. Nothing to see here, just move along, Joe Citizen. Except this case gets even stranger once you actually look at what the administration is saying about it publicly. Because they're not just accusing the SPLC of questionable financial practices. They're not framing this like, hey, maybe some nonprofit accounting rules were violated. No, they are publicly insinuating that the anti-hate organization was intentionally helping create the very extremism it claimed to oppose. That is one hell of an accusation. And the language they're using matters a lot, because there is a gigantic emotional difference between using informants inside extremist groups and funding extremism. One sounds like intelligence work, and the other sounds like a Bond villain origin story. And underneath all of this is a bigger question that America keeps refusing to fully deal with. Why does the modern political right seem so much more offended by the people monitoring extremist movements than by the extremist movements themselves? No, I mean, seriously, think about that. Because this story is not just about the SPLC. It's about political retaliation. It's about extremism. It's about selective outrage. It's about the blurry line between law enforcement and political vengeance. And maybe most importantly, it's about what happens when governments start treating ideological enemies like criminal conspiracies. So we're going to break this whole thing down in plain English, because right now this story is getting buried, I think, under the legal jargon, enough of it to suffocate a horse. Happy Wednesday, everybody, and welcome to Your Neighbor on the Left, the podcast where we talk about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, your host, and today we are going to be talking about the Southern Poverty Law Center, and specifically the case that the Justice Department has brought against them. It's been getting quite a few headlines, I think, and I'd be surprised if you haven't heard anything about it, but I want to break this down because it's a much more complicated story than I would imagine a lot of, certainly more complicated than the conservative news outlets are reporting, but probably even more complicated than what you're hearing anywhere. So before we can even really get into the details of this prosecution and whether or not it makes sense, we need to establish what the Southern Poverty Law Center actually is. Because depending on where you get your news, the SPLC is one of two things. It's either a heroic civil rights watchdog protecting democracy from violent extremist groups and, violent extremism in general. Or it's a cartoonishly evil left-wing smear factory that spends its time labeling everybody to the right of NPR as a fascist. And as usual, in America, reality is more complicated than cable news chyrons. The Southern Poverty Law Center was founded in 1971 in Montgomery, Alabama, which, historically speaking, is not a random location for a civil rights organization. Alabama, in the late 60s and early 70s, was still very much living in the long shadow of segregation and racial violence and Klan activity, voter suppression, all of it. The organization was founded primarily by civil rights attorneys Morris Dees and Joseph Levin Jr. And in the beginning, the mission was pretty straightforward. Use the legal system to go after racist organizations and defend civil rights. And for a while, the SPLC became genuinely famous for doing something that a lot of people at the time thought was impossible. They didn't just protest white supremacists and their organizations, they bankrupted them. That sort of became their thing. Not just, hey, these people are bad. Not just reports and press conferences and strongly worded letters. They used lawsuits to financially destroy certain extremist groups. And one of the biggest examples happened in the 1980s. In 1981, a 19-year-old black man named Michael Donald was lynched in Mobile, Alabama by members of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, let's pause there for a second, because I think sometimes Americans mentally sort of file lynching under ancient history, like black and white photographs and grainy documentaries narrated by, Ken Burns and music. This was 1981. Not 1881, not 1921, 1981. Ronald Reagan was president. Raiders of the Lost Ark was in theaters. People were already playing Pac-Man. And the Klan was still lynching black Americans. The SPLC represented Michael Donald's mother in a civil lawsuit against the United Klans of America. And they won a judgment so massive that it effectively bankrupted one of the largest Klan organizations in the country. That case changed the organization's reputation nationally because people realized, wait a second here. These guys aren't just documenting hate groups. They are hitting them where it hurts. Money. And over the years, the SPLC became one of the most visible anti-extremist organizations in America. They tracked neo-Nazis, white supremacist organizations, militia movements, skinhead groups, Christian nationalist extremists, anti-government movements, various flavors of people who think the Civil War ended in a disappointing way. And eventually, they created what became their most famous and controversial tool, the hate group map. Now, if you lean progressive, you probably hear hate group tracking and think, well, yeah, good. Somebody should probably keep an eye on the Nazis. Which, fair. But conservatives increasingly came to see the SPLC very differently. Because over time, the organization expanded beyond tracking explicitly violent racist groups and began labeling certain anti-LGBTQ organizations and anti-immigration groups and far-right organizations as extremist or hate-based. And that is where things got politically radioactive. Because once you move from here is a literal neo-Nazi organization to here is an organization we believe promotes hateful rhetoric, the arguments become much messier. Some conservatives accuse the SPLC of intentionally blurring the line between mainstream conservatism and extremism. And to be fair, there are legitimate debates to be had there. I think that part is important to say out loud. You can absolutely argue the SPLC has overreached in some classifications. You can argue some labels may be too broad. You can argue they sometimes paint with too wide a brush. That is a completely legitimate public conversation. But notice something important here. That is very different from saying the organization itself is a criminal enterprise, because there's also an argument to be made that the reason why the line's blurred is because the line's blurred between some of these radical groups and people who were trying to have themselves considered as mainstream conservatives. But now, just to repeat, the distinction is very different from saying the organization itself is a criminal enterprise and saying that they overreach sometimes. Those are not remotely the same claim. And honestly, this distinction matters throughout this entire episode, because one of the things that keeps happening in modern politics is that people collapse criticism into criminality. We disagree with this organization slowly morphs into this organization should be punished by the state. That escalation should concern you. And I think it should concern people in general more than it currently does. Now, one of the reasons conservatives became especially hostile toward the SPLC is because the organization's labels started carrying real-world consequences. Tech companies paid attention to SPLC reports. Advertisers paid attention. Journalists cited them constantly. Social media platforms referenced extremist databases when moderating content. So in other words, the SPLC stopped being just a watchdog organization and it became influential. And once an organization becomes influential in America, eventually half the country starts believing it's either saving democracy or secretly running the Illuminati from a Panera Bread conference room. There was also another major turning point in conservative hostility towards the SPLC. In 2012, a gunman attacked the Family Research Council headquarters in Washington, D.C. The shooter later admitted he targeted the organization after seeing it listed by the SPLC as an anti-LGBTQ hate group. Now, let me be crystal clear, because this part gets distorted constantly online. There is no evidence whatsoever that the SPLC encouraged violence. No evidence they coordinated anything. No evidence, zero, that they wanted that attack to happen. But conservatives seized on the incident immediately and argued that the SPLC's rhetoric created an environment where violence became more likely. And from that point forward, the organization became something bigger in conservative media. Not just that they were wrong, not just that they were biased, but now they were labeled as dangerous. And that's important because it helps explain why the political right has spent years building anger towards this organization. The resentment didn't appear suddenly overnight with this DOJ case that we're talking about. This has been simmering for a long time. And meanwhile, the SPLC just keeps doing what it does, tracking extremist movements. Which brings us to the uncomfortable part of this whole conversation. Because whether people like the SPLC or not, the extremist groups that they monitor are very, very real. Neo-Nazi groups are real. White nationalist organizations are real. Violent anti-government extremist movements are real. The Klan still exists. Though at this point, it mostly looks like a regional theater production of hatred than it does, a militant force. But the underlying movements are still there. And that raises a question that sits underneath this entire story. If extremist organizations still exist, if white supremacist groups still organize, if anti-democratic movements still recruit people online, then who exactly is supposed to monitor them? Because apparently now the federal government is arguing that one of the most famous anti-extremist organizations in America crossed the line from tracking extremism to somehow participating in it. And once we get into what the DOJ is actually alleging, things get really weird really quickly. All right, so let's get to the part of the story where the legal terminology starts flying around like somebody dropped a law dictionary into a blender. Wire fraud, money laundering conspiracy, false statements, shell companies, confidential sources. And the danger with stories like this, I think, is that people hear a bunch of complex legal language and immediately assume, well, I guess they must have done something terrible. Because legal jargon has a weird psychological effect on people. If a press conference contains enough paperwork vocabulary, Americans start nodding along like golden retrievers. So let's strip this down to plain English. The DOJ is not accusing the SPLC of secretly becoming Nazis. They are not alleging, in the legal sense, the organization ideologically supports white supremacy. That distinction matters because some of the public rhetoric around this case has been, let's just say, emotionally ambitious. What the DOJ is alleging is that the SPLC paid confidential informants embedded inside extremist organizations and that those payments were concealed in a deceptive way from donors and financial institutions. That's the core allegation right there. According to the indictment, now we're talking about the indictment, not the rhetoric. According to the indictment, the SPLC allegedly paid more than $3 million over roughly a decade of time to sources connected to extremist groups, including white supremacists and anti-government organizations. Now, on its face, that already sounds explosive. Anti-hate organizations secretly paid extremists? That's just headline catnip. That's the kind of sentence cable news producers hear and immediately start to levitate 3 inches above the floor. But this is where the wording becomes incredibly important, because there are two very different ways to describe what allegedly happened. Version 1 sounds like this. The SPLC used paid informants to gather intelligence about extremist groups. Now, that sounds like undercover work, surveillance, monitoring dangerous organizations. The other version sounds like this. The SPLC funded the very extremists it claimed to oppose. Now, that sounds like corruption and betrayal, fraud, in an ideological sense anyway. And the Trump administration is very clearly leaning into version 2. Hard. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche publicly accused the SPLC of manufacturing the extremism it purports to oppose by paying sources to stoke racial hatred. Now, I mean, think about that wording for a second. Manufacturing extremism. That's not a throwaway line. And it's not about bookkeeping. It's not we found accounting irregularities. That phrase paints a picture of an organization actively helping create racial tension in order to profit politically and financially from fear. That is a massive accusation. And maybe the government can prove elements of it. Maybe they can't. But rhetorically, they are absolutely framing this as something far, far more sinister than accounting violations. And again, a reminder, what the actual indictment is talking about are the accounting violations. The DOJ has also argued that donors believed they were contributing money to fight violent extremism, while some of that money instead benefited extremists through informant payments. Again, listen carefully to the emotional framing that's being used here. Benefited extremists, not funded intelligence gathering, not paid confidential sources, but benefited extremists. Words matter. I'm a huge believer in that axiom, especially when they come from the government. And then you have FBI Director Kash Patel publicly emphasizing that the SPLC allegedly raised money claiming it would dismantle extremist groups while secretly paying individuals inside those same groups. And here's where I think the administration's framing starts to get intentionally slippery, because they keep collapsing the distinction between infiltrating extremist groups and supporting extremist groups. Those are not the same thing. Not morally, not legally, not operationally. If a journalist pays a source inside a criminal organization for information, are they supporting organized crime? If the FBI pays an informant inside a militia group, and this happens all the time, but if they do that, if they pay an informant inside a militia group, are they funding extremism? If intelligence agencies pay confidential assets connected to terrorist organizations, are they then benefiting terrorists? I mean, technically speaking, in a narrow financial sense, money changes hands. So you could argue it's a benefit to the informant who received the money. But nobody talks about it that way in those examples I just gave, because everybody understands the broader purpose of intelligence gathering, or at least they usually do. That's why this case feels so strange to a lot of legal analysts and civil liberties people, because the administration's public messaging seems designed to erase that distinction emotionally in the minds of you and me, the average folks. And honestly, it's damn effective messaging, because informant operation sounds procedural, dry. Funding extremism, that sounds more like a Netflix documentary. And here's where the story starts moving beyond legal theories and into politics, because the administration clearly understands that the SPLC is already hated by large portions of the political right. So framing them as hypocrites Secretly financing hate groups is politically devastating, whether the criminal case ultimately succeeds or doesn't. It's another thing people need to understand. A prosecution does not have to end in a conviction to accomplish damage when you're talking about politics. Sometimes the accusation is the punishment, especially, in the social media era. Once the headline exists, anti-hate group accused of funding extremists, millions of people don't even read another sentence beyond that. That becomes the reality in their minds permanently. And to be fair, some aspects of the allegations are serious if true. The indictment claims payments were routed through intermediary entities in ways prosecutors say obscured the true purpose of the money. The government also alleges some informants continued participating in extremist activities while they were being paid. Now, that part matters because if prosecutors can demonstrate that the SPLC knowingly financed criminal conduct beyond passive intelligence gathering, the case becomes more dangerous for the organization from a legal standpoint. But even there, things get really murky fast because informants are almost never morally clean individuals. That's kind of the whole problem with informants. You don't infiltrate violent extremist organizations by recruiting Eagle Scouts and substitute teachers. The informants are very often criminals, sometimes dangerous criminals, sometimes people still partially involved in the movements being investigated. That has been true forever. And once you realize how intelligence operations usually work in real life, the administration's framing, it starts looking a lot more politically loaded. Because the federal government itself has spent decades paying deeply compromised people for information. Sometimes very dangerous people, sometimes violently dangerous people. Which, raises a pretty obvious question. If paying morally ugly people for intelligence gathering is standard operation procedure for the government, why is it suddenly being framed like unprecedented evil when the SPLC does it? And once you start actually looking at the FBI's actual history with informants, this whole thing starts getting really uncomfortable. All right, so now this is the section where the whole case starts wobbling quite a bit. Because once you understand how informants actually work in the real world, the administration's public framing of this case starts sounding selective. Let's put it that way. Here's the thing. The FBI uses informants constantly, not occasionally, not rarely, constantly. Organized crime investigations, drug cartels, terrorist cases, militia groups, human trafficking, political extremism, street gangs, white supremacist organizations. Informants are baked into modern law enforcement like oregano into a pizza. You almost cannot separate them. And the reason is pretty obvious if you think about it for a few seconds. Dangerous organizations usually do not live stream their criminal planning meetings on TikTok. You have to infiltrate them. You cultivate sources, you pay people, you gather information. That's how intelligence work functions. And yes, sometimes that means paying deeply unpleasant human beings. Because if somebody is inside a violent extremist organization, odds are pretty good they're not bringing a strong volunteer at the animal shelter vibe with them. Now, let's take organized crime, for example. The FBI spent decades using mafia informants. Some of them were literal murderers, extortionists, other deeply violent people. And perhaps the most infamous example is Whitey Bulger. Whitey Bulger was a brutal Boston mob boss connected to murder and racketeering and extortion, all sorts of violent crime. And despite that, the FBI used him as an informant for years against rival organized crime groups. And this wasn't some tiny scandal that nobody noticed. It became one of the most famous informant controversies in FBI history because agents were accused of protecting Bulger while he continued his criminal activity. Now, think about the emotional framing difference here. Nobody says the FBI secretly supported organized crime. Nobody's saying the federal government was pro-mafia. Why? Because people understand the distinction between using a compromised source and endorsing that source's ideology or its crimes. That distinction suddenly becomes very blurry in this SPLC case. And after 9/11, the use of informants, it exploded even further. Federal law enforcement agencies embedded confidential sources in suspected terror networks and mosques and militia circles and online extremist spaces, all kinds of environments. Sometimes very controversially. Actually, often controversially. There have been major civil liberties debates for years over whether FBI encouraged plots, manipulated vulnerable people, or aggressively cultivated extremist activity in order to justify arrests. Those debates are real, and they matter. But notice what almost never happens politically. Conservatives rarely frame those operations as funding terrorism, because everybody instinctively understands the broader national security argument when the government does this. But now suddenly we're supposed to believe that paying sources inside extremist organizations is inherently scandalous and morally outrageous. Really? Because if that standard were applied consistently, there'd be enough FBI investigations to keep lawyers employed until the heat death of the universe. And this gets even stranger when you look specifically at far-right extremist groups. Federal law enforcement has repeatedly used informants inside white nationalist organizations and anti-government militia groups and extremist movements that were connected to political violence. The Proud Boys had informants. Militia organizations had informants. January 6th investigations involved cooperating witnesses and embedded sources. Again, that is how these things work normally. You do not gather intelligence on extremist movements by standing outside headquarters with binoculars like a confused raccoon. You get inside. You get people inside. Now, to be fair, there is a counter-argument here. Critics would say the FBI is the government. The SPLC is a private nonprofit raising donor money under the banner of fighting hate. Okay, fine. That distinction exists. But if that's the concern, then the public argument should sound like this. Did the SPLC improperly disclose or manage informant operations? Instead, the administration officials are using language suggesting that the SPLC was actively manufacturing extremism itself. That's a very different claim. And honestly, I think that distinction is the entire ballgame here. Because once you erase the line between infiltration and endorsement, you can make almost any intelligence operation sound evil. Imagine applying that same rhetoric across the board. The DEA paid cartel members. The FBI funded organized crime. The CIA supported terrorism. And you can see how fast that can escalate. And to be crystal clear, this does not automatically mean the SPLC handled everything perfectly. That's important. It is entirely possible that some payments were handled improperly. It's entirely possible that disclosure practices were questionable. It's entirely possible prosecutors uncover behavior that deserves criticism. Those possibilities exist, but that is still very different from the anti-hate group was secretly pro-extremism. And the administration's public rhetoric keeps nudging people, at least emotionally, towards that second conclusion. That is politically loaded. There is no doubt about it. Because the language is doing more explaining than the charges. It's telling a story different than the charges. And the story they're telling is basically the people claiming to fight hate were actually helping create it. That's not a legal framing. That's ideological demolition. And honestly, there's another layer to this that makes me deeply uncomfortable. The people cheering this prosecution the loudest are often the same people who spent years warning about weaponized government. And you remember all that rhetoric. I know I do. The deep state, political persecution, federal overreach, government retaliation against ideological opponents. Now suddenly the federal government is aggressively prosecuting one of the American right's oldest ideological enemies. And a lot of those concerns seem to have evaporated into thin air, which tells me that for some people, the objection wasn't ever really government power should not be abused. It was more along the lines of government power should not be used against my side. And listen, Democrats are capable of hypocrisy. Absolutely. This isn't unique to conservatives. Americans in general tend to become, constitutional scholars the moment political power changes hands. I've mentioned this before. But this case specifically feels like a perfect collision of three things: law enforcement, political grievance, and cultural revenge. Once you understand how long the political right has despised the SPLC, the timing and tone of this prosecution starts looking a lot less random. I don't think that you can fully understand this prosecution unless you understand something very important. For a large portion of the American right, the SPLC is not viewed as a neutral civil rights organization. It's viewed as an enemy. And not just an ideological enemy, a cultural enemy. One of the organizations that conservatives believe helped shape the modern system of labeling, deplatforming, moderation, advertiser pressure, and other social stigma aimed at the political right. That's how they see the SPLC. Now, whether you agree with that perception or not, that perception absolutely exists. And it has existed for years. Because the SPLC's influence grew way beyond lawsuits against the Klan. Over time, journalists cited their hate group database constantly. Tech companies referenced their research. Advertisers paid attention to their classification. Social media companies monitored extremist tracking reports. The SPLC became one of the major reference points in America for identifying extremist movements. And conservatives increasingly saw that influence as dangerous, especially because the organization expanded beyond explicitly violent racist groups into broader ideological territory. Now, again, some of this criticism exists in good faith. There are legitimate debates about where the line exists between harmful rhetoric and a hate movement. And that's a real conversation. But the political right increasingly came to see the SPLC not as a watchdog organization, but as a kind of ideological hall monitor for, on behalf of liberal America. And then came the moment that completely supercharged conservative hostility towards the organization. That's the 2012 Family Research Council shooting that I mentioned. Gunmen entered the FRC headquarters in Washington, D.C., armed with a pistol and bags of Chick-fil-A sandwiches, which somehow sounds fake, but it was very real. He intended, according to investigators, to kill people and smear sandwiches in their faces as a political statement tied to anti-LGBTQ activism. America is such a profoundly strange country sometimes. Now, the shooter later admitted he targeted the Family Research Council after seeing the organization listed by the SPLC as an anti-LGBTQ hate group. And conservatives took that and ran with it. To them, it wasn't just the SPLC disagrees with us. It became the SPLC is irresponsibly demonizing mainstream conservatives in a way that could inspire violence. Now, again, I want to be extremely clear about this because nuance gets murdered online every day before breakfast. There is no evidence, zero evidence, that the SPLC encouraged violence. None. The organization condemned the shooting. There was no coordination, no incitement, no secret plot. But politically, that incident changed everything, because from that point forward, conservative media increasingly framed the SPLC as something more sinister than merely just being biased. They framed it as dangerous. And honestly, that's the point where the relationship between the political right and the SPLC stopped being a policy disagreement thing and became something closer to a blood feud, especially during the Trump era. Because the Trump years have intensified this entire conversation around extremism and nationalism, race, political violence, and phrases like the enemy within. And this is where things start really getting uncomfortable for the Republicans. Because while it is absolutely true that not every conservative is a racist, it is also very true that racist and extremist movements in modern America overwhelmingly gravitate toward the political right. That's not my opinion. That is observable reality. Neo-Nazis are not showing up to Bernie Sanders rallies, waving signs, and demanding universal preschool. KKK groups are not organizing around climate change legislation. White nationalist Telegram channels are not spending their weekends defending drag brunches and labor unions. That does not mean conservatism itself equals racism. To say that is absurd. But it does raise an uncomfortable question. Why do openly racist movements consistently feel politically at home in that same ecosystem? And instead of confronting that question directly, what often happens is the right becomes furious at the people who point it out. Which is one reason organizations like the SPLC became lightning rods during the Trump years. They aren't just documenting extremist groups anymore. They were documenting patterns, connections, rhetoric, overlaps, radicalization pipelines. And a lot of conservatives interpreted that not as legitimate watchdog work, but as an attempt to smear the broader right by association. Now, add Trump himself into this equation, because Trump's political style changed the emotional tone of American politics dramatically. I am your retribution. That's not a subtle statement. That's not let's restore institutional trust. That sounds like the final line before the villain turns around, slowly in a movie. And throughout Trump's political career, there's been this recurring rhetoric about the deep state and political enemies and traitors and weaponized institutions and the enemy from within. That language matters because it conditions supporters to view opposition not merely as disagreement, but as sabotage. And once you frame politics in that way, retaliation starts feeling morally justified. No longer dangerous, no longer alarming, necessary. That is why this prosecution raises eyebrows, even among legal observers who are not exactly card-carrying progressive activists, because context matters. If a neutral administration with no prior political hostility towards the SPLC brought these charges, people would still debate the legal merits, but the political interpretation would be less obvious. This isn't happening in a vacuum. This is happening under an administration whose movement has spent years portraying the SPLC as a corrupt enemy. That changes how people interpret motive. And honestly, motive matters because prosecutors are human beings. Governments are not emotionless robots floating through space and, just spewing neutral justice into society. Political environments influence priorities. And if you don't believe that, I would gently remind you that politicians openly campaign on revenge now. Not subtly, not between the lines, directly. Lines like, "I am your retribution." That is an extraordinary thing for a presidential candidate to say out loud. And Americans have gotten so desensitized to this rhetoric that half the country barely even blinked. Imagine hearing that sentence from literally any other modern president. Imagine if Obama had said that. National meltdown. Congress holds emergency hearings. People would assume he got replaced by, an alien. But Trump says it, and millions of supporters hear strength. So when the DOJ aggressively prosecutes one of the political right's longest-standing ideological enemies, people are naturally going to question the motive. Especially because the administration's rhetoric around the case doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound like we discovered concerning financial misconduct. It sounds like the enemy organization has finally been exposed. And that emotional framing matters because, once governments start treating ideological opponents like enemies, to be destroyed rather than citizens to be debated with, history shows us that things tend to get really ugly from that point. So now I want to talk about the extremist question that everybody dances around. This is probably the most uncomfortable section of this episode. And honestly, it's uncomfortable because Americans are terrible at talking about extremism in a nuanced way. We have two modes, either hysterical exaggeration or complete denial. There's very little middle ground. So let's start with something that should be painfully obvious. Not every conservative is a racist. Not every Republican is a white nationalist. Not every Trump voter secretly owns a tiki torch and a subscription to Confederate Enthusiast Monthly. That's nonsense. America is a huge country. People vote Republican for all sorts of reasons. Taxes, guns, religion, abortion, economic policy, cultural conservatism, because their dad voted Republican, because they hate Democrats, because cable news turned their brain into soup. All kinds of reasons. Human beings are complicated. But it is also true that the modern white supremacist movements overwhelmingly gravitate towards the political right. And I feel like Americans spend so much time screaming at each other about that sentence that we never actually stop to examine it. Look around. Charlottesville, neo-Nazi rallies, white nationalist groups, the Proud Boys, accelerationist movements, replacement theory rhetoric, Nick Fuentes, and that whole orbit of internet nonsense. Extremist symbolism showing up at pro-Trump demonstrations. January 6th defendants with affiliations to militias and these other groups. When racist organizations organize in America, they are not generally marching for universal health care. That's just simply reality. And I know some conservatives immediately get defensive when they hear that. But think about why. Because there's a really important distinction here that keeps getting lost. Saying that extremist groups overwhelmingly align themselves with the political right is not the same thing as saying that every conservative agrees with extremists. Those are completely different claims. And honestly, I think one reason this conversation gets so emotionally bogged down and explosive is because a lot of ordinary conservatives hear criticism of extremist overlap as a personal moral condemnation. Like, you're calling my grandfather a Nazi because he likes lower taxes. No, that is not what people are saying. That is not what I am saying. The criticism that many people have of the MAGA movement is not that every supporter personally shares extremist beliefs. It's that the movement keeps attracting extremist support, and then often treats the people pointing it out as the problem instead of the extremists. That is the issue. And you see this pattern over and over again. A white nationalist group praises Trump rhetoric, and instead of the conversation becoming, why are these people so comfortable here? The conversation instead becomes, how dare you point that out? Like somebody discovering, raccoons living in the attic and becoming furious at the flashlight. And listen, political movements do not fully control who supports them. Of course they don't. There are probably deeply weird people who support universal health care because they think vaccines contain Wi-Fi signals. Every movement attracts oddballs. But there is a difference between random fringe weirdness and recurring ideological alignment. And the recurring alignment here matters because extremist groups themselves clearly perceive something. They hear rhetoric about replacement. They hear anti-immigration fear messaging. They hear nationalist grievance politics. They hear, real Americans. They hear demonization of minorities and journalists and LGBTQ people and universities and blue cities. And they think, yeah, that sounds closer to our worldview than the other side. And that should concern people. I don't understand why it doesn't. And again, this is where reaction becomes important. If neo-Nazis enthusiastically supported my political movement, my first instinct would be to say, get these people away from me immediately. Publicly, loudly, and repeatedly, I would say that. I wouldn't say things that started with, well, technically, or the media is exaggerating, or, what about Antifa? Because normal people don't want the endorsement of white supremacists. But too often what happens instead is they get defensive. They try to minimize the situation. They try to deny the situation. Or anger gets directed towards the journalists or whoever is bringing it up. And eventually people start asking an uncomfortable question. If a political movement constantly has to explain why Nazis keep showing up at its rallies, at what point does the conversation stop being about coincidence? Now, to be fair, Democrats and progressives can absolutely engage in guilt by association nonsense too. That happens. Politics in general has become a giant machine for flattening nuance into screaming matches. But the reason organizations like the SPLC gained influence in the first place is because extremist movements in America never actually disappeared. They just evolved. The Klan shrank, but white nationalism adapted online. Neo-Nazi movements modernized. Conspiracy ecosystems exploded on social media. Anti-government extremism mutated into internet radicalization pipelines. And somebody has to track this stuff. Somebody has to monitor the forums and the organizations and the recruiting patterns, the propaganda networks. That's part of why the SPLC exists. Maybe you disagree with some of their classifications. Maybe you think that they overreach sometimes. Fine. That is a valid position. But the broader mission itself emerged because extremist organizations are real and often dangerous. And this is where the administration's behavior starts feeling deeply ironic. Because at a moment when extremist rhetoric has become so much more mainstream than at any point in decades, the federal government appears more focused on attacking one of the organizations tracking that extremism than they are with dealing with the extremist movements themselves. That's impossible not to notice. And honestly, this entire dynamic has created one of the strangest features of modern American politics. The people warning about authoritarianism are often treated as more dangerous than the people openly flirting with authoritarianism. Think about that. An anti-hate organization infiltrates an extremist group or extremist groups. Government crackdown. But a politician says immigrants are poisoning the blood of the country. Nothing. Shrugs. People who document extremism get accused of manufacturing extremism. Meanwhile, actual extremism keeps inching closer and closer to the political mainstream, like mold spreading across bread in a humid kitchen. And this is why the SPLC case feels bigger than just one prosecution, because underneath it sits a much larger cultural battle over who gets labeled extremist, who gets protected, who gets investigated, and who gets treated like a real threat. And once the government starts deciding that watchdog organizations themselves are enemies, that road does not lead to wonderful places. So after all of this, we arrive at the practical question. Okay, fine. Put politics aside for a moment. Rhetoric aside. Cable news vomit aside. Can the DOJ actually win this case? And the honest answer is maybe. But it's probably a lot more complicated than the headlines are making it sound. Because one thing Americans really need to understand is that an indictment is not the same as guilt. The federal government can indict people for all kinds of reasons. Strong evidence, weak evidence, political pressure, strategic pressure, overcharging, public messaging, negotiation leverage. The list goes on and on. There's an old saying that prosecutors can indict a ham sandwich. Now, obviously, that's exaggerated, but the point is grand juries are not trials. The government only needs enough evidence to establish probable cause for charges. That is a much, much lower standard than proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And fraud cases in particular get very messy because prosecutors usually have to prove intent. Not just something questionable happened. They often have to prove people knowingly deceived donors, knowingly concealed information, knowingly misrepresented transactions, or intentionally structured things to avoid disclosure. That gets harder than a lot of people realize, especially when the defense can argue these were confidential intelligence operations involving dangerous extremist groups. Secrecy was part of operational necessity. That argument is not absurd. In fact, it's probably going to become central to the defense. And several legal analysts have already raised concerns about parts of the government's theory. Bloomberg Law, for example, reported that some experts questioned whether prosecutors properly established certain required elements tied to financial institution fraud allegations. Let me translate that into plain English. Basically, some legal observers think the DOJ may be trying to force ethically murky behavior into criminal categories that don't perfectly fit. That does not mean the case collapses automatically, but it does matter because prosecutors do not just need emotionally satisfying narratives. They need legally coherent ones. And those are not always the same thing. A jury can emotionally dislike something while still concluding, I'm not sure this technically meets the legal standard. That happens all the time. And honestly, this case feels especially vulnerable to that tension because the administration's public rhetoric is so emotionally aggressive. Manufacturing extremism, funding hate, benefiting extremists. That language creates a very dramatic public narrative. But once you get inside the courtroom, things become technical. Jurors eventually have to hear specific questions answered, like, were donors intentionally deceived? Were disclosures knowingly false? Were shell entities used in a criminal way? Did the organization intentionally conceal operational realities in a way that violates a federal law? Those are narrower questions than simply saying, does this sound morally gross? And frankly, informant operations often do sound morally gross. That's part of why they're controversial. Because intelligence gathering is not a clean business. The FBI has used gang members, drug traffickers, violent criminals, terror suspects. Sometimes informants commit crimes while they are cooperating. Sometimes agencies continue relationships with deeply compromised people because they view the intelligence value as worth the moral contamination. Again, none of that automatically makes it good, but it does make it normal within the world of intelligence gathering. Which means the SPLC defense team is almost certainly going to hammer this point relentlessly. They're likely going to argue, you may dislike how the informant operations work, but this structure is not remotely unprecedented. And honestly, that argument probably lands with at least some jurors, especially if the defense can successfully frame the prosecution as politically motivated. Because motive matters emotionally when it's not technically, even when it's not technically part of the legal standard. Jurors are human beings, and if they start suspecting this feels like the government targeting an ideological enemy, the prosecution's job suddenly got a lot harder. And with all this rhetoric, again, that you're hearing from Kash Patel and the acting attorney general, it's a very easy argument to make that there's political motivation behind this. Now, none of this means that the SPLC is necessarily in the clear. Discovery could absolutely produce embarrassing information, internal communications, financial records, operational discussions, poorly worded emails, risky decisions. Organizations involved in sensitive intelligence-style operations often look messy under a microscope. And if prosecutors uncover evidence suggesting leadership knowingly crossed legal boundaries beyond confidential sourcing, the case could become much more dangerous. That possibility does exist. But right now, based on publicly available information, a lot of legal observers seem skeptical that this is not the slam dunk the administration's rhetoric seems to be making it out to be. And honestly, even if the DOJ ultimately loses the case, politically, they probably still achieve part of what they wanted, because public perception often freezes at the indictment. Americans hear the anti-hate group funded extremists, and they never follow the story to its conclusion to see dismissed counts and evidentiary disputes and, technical legal arguments or acquittals for that matter. The accusation itself becomes the permanent cultural memory. So that's one reason politically charged prosecutions are so dangerous, because even unsuccessful prosecutions can still wound institutions permanently. And whether you love the SPLC or hate the SPLC, or barely even knew they existed before all this started happening, the broader principle should concern you. Because governments wield enormous narrative power when they prosecute people. Once the state publicly declares an organization suspicious or corrupt or fraudulent or dangerous or whatever, that stain itself can outlive any evidence. And historically speaking, governments have not always used that power wisely. So, to wrap things up here, one of the things that worries me the most about modern American politics right now is how casually we've all started talking about using state power against ideological enemies. Not criminals, not violent actors, not people proven guilty in court, just enemies. That language has become weirdly normal. And once a society starts sorting political opposition into categories like real Americans and internal threats, things can go sideways really fast. History is full of examples. Nixon had an enemies list. COINTELPRO targeted activists, journalists, civil rights leaders, anti-war organizers. McCarthyism destroyed lives just through accusations and paranoia long before many people ever stepped inside a courtroom. And the scary thing is none of those periods felt scary to everybody while they were happening. That's an important thing to remember. People always imagine, authoritarian creep arriving with dramatic movie music and giant flashing warning lights that blink. But it usually arrives disguised as security and patriotism and order and common sense, or, finally somebody's doing something. That's how it works. You normalize the idea that certain groups are not merely wrong, but dangerous. Not merely just your political opponent, but threats to the nation. And once that mindset takes hold, extraordinary uses of government power start feeling justified, at least emotionally. Now listen, you do not have to believe the SPLC is flawless to recognize why this situation should make you uneasy. You can think they overreach. You can dismiss parts of their rhetoric. You can disagree with some of their classifications. None of that automatically means the federal government aggressively prosecuting them is wise, healthy, or free of political motivation. Those are separate questions. And honestly, I think one of the biggest problems in America right now is that people increasingly evaluate government behavior based entirely on whether it hurts people they already dislike. That is an incredibly dangerous instinct. Because power changes hands. It always does. And every expansion of retaliatory political power eventually becomes a weapon future administrations can pick up and use as well. That's one reason principles matter, or at least, they're supposed to. If your belief in civil liberties disappears the moment your political opponents become the target, then what you actually believe in is team sports, not democracy. And this is where the SPLC becomes bigger than the SPLC itself. Because underneath this prosecution is a deeper cultural question America still hasn't answered honestly. What do we do about extremism in a democracy? Seriously. How do you monitor violent extremist movements without accusations of political bias? How do you track white nationalism without getting accused of attacking conservatives? How do you infiltrate dangerous organizations without becoming morally contaminated by the process? How do you balance civil liberties against legitimate security concerns? Those are hard questions. But one thing that absolutely does not help is pretending extremist movements aren't real in the first place. They are very, very real. White supremacist groups are real. Political violence is real. Radicalization pipelines are real. Authoritarian rhetoric is real. And I think part of why this case hits such a nerve is because it feels like we're drifting into a reality where the people documenting extremism are increasingly treated as more suspicious than the extremism itself. If that doesn't bother you, I need to know why. And maybe the DOJ ultimately proves serious misconduct happened. Maybe they uncover, genuinely illegal behavior. Maybe the SPLC made decisions that crossed ethical or legal lines. It's a possibility. But even if that turns out to be true, it would still be worth asking whether the administration's public framing of this case has been politically loaded in ways that should concern all of us. Because rhetoric matters. The emotional framing matters. Governments do not merely enforce laws, they shape public narrative. And right now the narrative is being pushed is not, we discovered questionable nonprofit disclosure practices. What's being pushed is the anti-hate organization was secretly helping create hate. It's a powerful story, politically speaking, especially in a country where millions of people already distrust institutions. Journalists, universities, activists, nonprofits, experts, basically anything with a mission statement longer than a Waffle House menu. And honestly, maybe that's the part that leaves me the most uneasy, not just the prosecution itself, but the appetite for it, the excitement, the sense of satisfaction some people seem to feel watching state power turn toward ideological enemies. Because once political power starts wearing the justice system like a glove, eventually everybody feels the fingers around their throat. All right, everybody, thank you so much for taking the time to download and listen to this episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. I would really love to hear from you on this episode or on any episode on whatever, compliments, critiques, suggestions, whatever. You can go to the website, neighborontheleft.com, and go to the contacts page and either use social media to send a direct message or use the email address. Reach out and let me know what you're thinking. While you're on the website, you could check out the episodes section where you can stream or download any episode, and go to the blog section where I post mirrors of the topics that I talk about on the podcast, and I include all of my sources, which I tend to think is very important these days, to say where you're getting your information from. I will be back on Friday with a Back Porch Files episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. So between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.